today as we continue with our series of messages from the Gospel of Mark. I ask you to turn once again to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, and our text this morning is taken from verses 30 through 37. Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know it. He taught his disciples and said to them, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day." But they did not understand this saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" They kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." If you were with us last Lord's Day, you remember that Jesus has just healed a young demon-possessed boy who was violently abused by a demon for most of his young life. A short time after that miracle, perhaps even later that same day, or possibly the next day, Jesus and his disciples departed from the region of Caesarea Philippi, where that miracle took place, and they headed south to Galilee. And I want you to notice in verse 30, Mark tells us, "And he did not want anyone to know it." Now, why does Jesus want to keep his presence in Galilee a secret? Well, verse 31 answers that for us. Mark says, "For he taught his disciples and said to them, 'The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day.'" You see, the reason Jesus wanted to keep his presence in Galilee a big secret was because he's getting closer and closer to the cross, and to that time when he will depart from this world and go back to his Heavenly Father. And so he has many things he needs to teach his disciples in this short period of time. And what Jesus has to teach them is not for the ears of huge multitudes of people. This information is only for the ears of his 12 disciples. Now, this is the second time Jesus talks to his disciples about his crucifixion. You remember the first time was in the previous chapter, Mark chapter 8. The elements of this second prediction of his death are basically the same as the first, that he would be killed and that he would rise again on the third day. But Jesus unveils a new revelation in this second prediction that he did not mention the first time. And that is that the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of men. There was no mention of a betrayer the first time. And no doubt this new piece of information piqued the curiosity of the disciples. But you notice in verse 32, Mark says, "But they did not understand this saying." They were afraid to ask him. You remember after Jesus revealed his impending crucifixion the first time, Peter pulled him aside and rebuked him. "Lord, you don't need to be talking like this. You don't need to be talking about your death." And then Jesus rebuked Peter and the other disciples. He said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you do not have the things of God in mind, but the things of men." And so perhaps that stinging rebuke after the first time Jesus talked about his death was still in the back of the disciples' minds. They didn't want this to happen again, which would explain why none of the disciples said a word, and they didn't dare ask Jesus any questions this time. Now, the key thing I want to note here is that the disciples still do not understand the true nature of Jesus' mission. It's still not registering with them that Jesus is not going to establish an earthly kingdom, but rather he is going to be crucified. He is going to die in a very violent manner. They still don't get it. As we move on to verses 33 through 37, the scene suddenly changes from some unknown remote location in Galilee to a house in Capernaum. Remember, Capernaum was Jesus' headquarters during his earthly ministry. And, while we're not given any information regarding this house that Mark speaks of here, in all likelihood it's referring to Peter's house, where Jesus had stayed before when he was in Capernaum. Now, there are three thoughts that I want us to consider in verses 33 through 37. First of all, let's consider the dispute. Look again at verses 33 and 34. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. You remember after Jesus talked a second time about his crucifixion, verse 32 tells us that the disciples were afraid to ask him any questions. Well, now that they are settled into this house in Capernaum, Jesus asked his disciples a question. What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? In other words, what were you guys arguing about back there? Now, the disciples didn't say a word. They were too embarrassed to tell Jesus what their dispute had been over, because they'd been arguing about which one of them was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Now, what would have prompted that discussion? Why would they be arguing over which one of them was the greatest? Well, remember when they were back up in Caesarea Philippi just a short time earlier, Jesus only allowed 3 of the 12 disciples to go with him up on the Mount of Transfiguration. He took Peter, James, and John. And remember when they came down off of the mountain, Jesus instructed those 3 not to tell anyone what they had witnessed on the mountain. And you know, perhaps without revealing any of the details of what they had witnessed, Peter, James, and John probably couldn't help but talk about it in the presence of the other disciples. Maybe they said something like, "Wow, you guys wouldn't believe what we just saw. We've never seen anything like that in our whole lives. Man, that was incredible." But they didn't give any details. Now, I mean, we've all had people do that to us before, haven't we? We've had people all excited about telling us about something, and yet they don't give us any of the details. We wonder what is it they're all excited about. Well, that's probably what the disciples did. Man, you should have seen what we saw. But they didn't tell them any of the details of what happened. And so while they're coming down off of this spiritual mountaintop experience, remember the other 9 disciples have been involved in a nasty, heated argument with the scribes over their failure to be able to cast the demon out of that little boy. So are you starting to get the picture here? Perhaps Peter, James, and John are feeling a bit superior to the other disciples because of what they just witnessed on the mountain. And the remaining 9 disciples are feeling inferior because they were left out. They weren't included in that. So while they were traveling from Caesarea Philippi down to Capernaum, perhaps the other 9 were asking a whole lot of questions about what happened up there on that mountain. And Peter, James, and John were not giving them any details. And so somewhere along the way, they started to dispute among themselves about who would be given the greatest positions in the Messiah's kingdom. And you know, you can almost hear the argument. Perhaps Peter said, well, it's obvious the Lord will give me a high position. I'm the leader of this pack. And remember, I was the first one to proclaim Jesus is the Messiah. And then maybe Andrew spoke up and said, now hold your horses there, big brother. Remember, I was the one who introduced you to Jesus, and if it weren't for me, you'd still be out there fishing for a living. And then maybe James and John got in on the dispute. Well, hold it right there, guys. We were among the first to start following Jesus, and we've been following Him longer than any of the rest of you. And maybe even old Judas Iscariot chimed in. Well, what about me? He trusted me to take care of all of the money. That ought to count for something. And so back and forth they go, arguing over which one of them is the greatest, totally oblivious to the truth that they are walking behind the one who is the greatest. Look at this dispute in the context of everything that has just happened. Jesus has just revealed His heavenly glory on the Mount of Transfiguration. He has just demonstrated His power over demons by casting the demon out of that little boy. And He has just told His disciples for the second time that He is going to be killed and that He will rise again on the 3rd day. And all they can do is fight over which one of them is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. How many times the disciples must have disappointed and frustrated Jesus with their failure to grasp the big picture. And you know what? This desire to be the greatest in the Lord's kingdom did not end with the disciples. In 3 John, John condemns a man in the church by the name of Diotrephes, who loved to have preeminence over all the other church members. He wanted to be number 1 in the church. He wanted everyone to treat him as though he were the most important member of the church. You know, sadly, in almost every church today, there are those who seek the highest seats of honor. There are those who want to receive recognition and praise for everything they do. They want everybody to look up to them as the greatest and the most important member of the church. Brothers and sisters, listen carefully to me. No one in this church is any more or any less important than anyone else. We are all sinners who have been saved by the grace of God. And we are all servants of the living God and servants to one another. And from the pulpit all the way to the back pew, all of us are the same. And that is the truth that Jesus drives home to His disciples in our next point. Let's consider the declaration. Verse 35. And He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. You know, it would have been so easy for Jesus to have just simply said, excuse me, guys, but I'm number 1. I'm the greatest in the kingdom. He could have said that. But instead of doing that, Jesus uses their dispute as a teaching moment. And as he's done before, he teaches them with another paradoxical statement. You remember the last paradox he taught them was in the previous chapter, in Mark 8:35, when Jesus said, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." A paradox is the exact opposite of what it seems logical. And so now here in Mark chapter 9, verse 35, after questioning his disciples over what they were arguing about and who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom, Jesus gives them this paradox. If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Now there's two things I want to note about that statement. First of all, Jesus is describing himself in that statement. He truly is first, is he not? He is the Son of the living God. He is the Messiah. He's the King of all kings. He's the Lord of all lords. And yet he came to this earth and he assumed the position of the lowliest of all servants of men. The second thing I want to note about that statement is its meaning to Jesus' disciples and to all of us. In essence, Jesus is saying this: if you want to be in the front of the line, get to the back of the line. The way to greatness is not found in the seat of honor, but in the seat of humility. The Lord is not looking for celebrities and superstars. The Lord is looking for humble servants. Jesus is trying to get his disciples to understand that in his kingdom there has to be a reversal of values from the way the world thinks. The Lord wants his disciples to place a higher value on humble service than upon personal prestige and high positions. And this is a stern warning to every follower of Christ who would seek the praise and the recognition and the accolades of men. James chapter 4 verse 10 says, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." You know, that flies right in the face of our me-first American society, doesn't it? In our society, people are pushing and shoving all the way to the top. People are stepping all over everybody else, trying to reach the highest rung on the ladder. And many are willing to do just about anything, regardless of how illegal, immoral, or unethical, to become the best, to become the greatest, to become the highest paid, to become the most famous, to become the most awarded, to be the fastest. People are willing to sell their souls to be the greatest, to be number one. And Jesus says, that's not how things work in my kingdom. In my kingdom, if you want to be great, bow down and serve others. As we move on to verses 36 and 37, Jesus now gives his disciples a demonstration of the kind of humble spirit that he's looking for in his followers. Verse 36 says, "Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them," verse 37, "Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." Now we know later on the night before he's crucified, Jesus will demonstrate the kind of humble servant he desires for his followers to be by bowing down and washing his disciples' feet. That will come later. But on this occasion, Jesus uses a little child in his demonstration. Now, why a little child? Well, perhaps there were a couple of reasons. First of all, in the Jewish society of that day, children were viewed as being the bottom of the social ladder. Children were viewed as property, and they were largely ignored by the adult population. But a second reason Jesus may have used a little child in this demonstration was because a little child can't do anything for an adult. A little child cannot enhance one's position in society. A little child can't pull strings and get one a promotion or a pay raise. A little child can't do anything to improve or guarantee a person's success. But a little child can teach us a whole lot about serving. Stop and think about it. From the very first day your child or your children were born, they needed to be served. Every need that your children had to be met by you. And when that child was born, you had to give and give and give. And as they grew older, you still had to give and give and give. And many of us have learned that even after they became adults, we're still giving and giving and giving. There's nothing you won't do to help your children. There's no task too menial. No task too unimportant. And in many ways, we are still serving our children. And so Jesus used a little child because little children need to be served. And they cannot serve us in return. And that's exactly the point Jesus wants His disciples to get. When it comes to serving others, we need to keep our attitudes and our motives in check. We must not be guilty of serving only those who can do something for us in return. Nor should we serve others as a means to receive personal glory and recognition. We must be willing to serve the neediest of people, and the poorest of people, and the lowliest of people. People who do not have the physical or material or financial means to do anything for us in return. And you know, chances are there will be times when you serve others that they won't thank you. They won't appreciate you. They won't express any kind of gratitude toward you for your service. But you know what? If your heart is right and your motives are pure, you will continue to serve others, realizing that it is truly the Lord Himself you're serving and not simply people. This week I want to challenge all of you to do something. I want to ask you to pray that God will open doors of opportunity for you to serve others this week. It may be helping someone whose car is broken down alongside the road. It may be carrying someone to a doctor's appointment or picking up a prescription for someone who's homebound. It may be going to sit with someone in the hospital, sitting beside their bedside. It may be giving some money to help someone who is in financial need. It may be carrying some food to a shut-in or to someone who just got home from the hospital. It could be any one of a number of things. And you know, that's the way it is with service in the Lord's kingdom. There are endless ways to serve others. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And let me warn you ahead of time that if you sincerely pray that prayer, Lord, open doors of opportunity for me to help and serve someone this week, you better be prepared to serve. You better be prepared to serve. I know because I speak from experience. You see, the Lord will open doors that you never expected to serve people that you may or may not know. And you will know that the Lord had His hand in it when He does. Will you pray that prayer this week? Lord, open doors of opportunity for me to serve others this week. During the Revolutionary War, General George Washington walked up on a group of men who were trying to pull down a tree. And they were almost able to get the job done, but they lacked just enough strength to do it. If only they had the help of just one more man. Well, General Washington noticed their commanding officer was standing off to the side shouting orders. And General Washington said to the officer, "Why don't you help them?" Not realizing who he was talking to, the officer responded indignantly, "Sir, I am their commander. I give the orders. They do the work." Without a word, George Washington got down off of his horse. He took off his coat. He rolled up his sleeves. And he gave the tired men the help that they needed to complete their task of pulling down that tree. And when they were finished, General Washington looked at the commanding officer and he said, "Sir, if your men need any further assistance, please call me anytime." The officer said, "Well, thank you, friend. And where may I call you if I need you?" And Washington responded, "You can find me in the commanding general's tent." And with that, General Washington rode off, leaving the embarrassed officer standing in complete silence. Who is the greatest in the kingdom? Those who humbly and selflessly serve others with no desire for personal glory or personal gain. Who is the greatest in the kingdom? Those who follow the example of Jesus, who came here to serve and not be served. If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant